In a records office off the Roman Forum, a clerk copies out the 9th honour voted to Gaius Julius Caesar in as many months, another decree for a stack that is starting to crowd the shelf. Down the street, a chair of gold sits on a low dais inside the Senate house, built for one man to sit in and no other. Caesar has just come home from Spain, from a war against the last sons of his rival Pompey, and Rome does not know what to do with him except keep giving him more. More titles, more statues, more power stacked on power, until a dictatorship that once had a fixed end date has none at all. This is the year that decision gets made and unmade. It runs from a triumph the city was not sure it should celebrate to a spring morning, when men who had eaten at his table opened his chest with their knives, and it ends with the strange discovery that killing a man is easier than killing what he built. Along the way there is a queen from Egypt living in his gardens, a crown offered and refused in front of a cheering crowd, a soothsayer's warning nobody quite believes, and a folded note that never gets read in time. This is the year Rome decided, one honour at a time, that it could no longer tell the difference between a great man and a king. Dust is still on the road from Spain when word reaches Rome that Gaius Julius Caesar has won again, this time at a place called Munda, against an army led by the two surviving sons of a man who had once been his equal and his rival, Pompey the Great. The battle in March had been close enough that Caesar himself is said to have told friends afterward that he had fought for his life that day, not merely for victory, the first time he had said such a thing about any battle in 15 years of war. Now, in the autumn, he is coming home to celebrate it properly, with a triumph, the ancient Roman ceremony in which a victorious general parades his army, his captives, and his plunder through the city streets while the crowd cheers and a slave is said to ride behind him, murmuring that he is only a man. Rome has seen 4 of Caesar's triumphs already, for Gaul, for Egypt, for the kingdom of Pontus in the east, for Africa. This 5th one is different, and everyone lining the route knows it, because the men Caesar beat at Munda were not foreign kings or barbarian tribes. They were Romans. Sextus and Gnaeus, Pompey's sons, had raised their army out of Roman citizens and provincial Roman soldiers, veterans of a civil war that had already torn through Italy, Greece, Egypt, and North Africa over the past 4 years, and celebrating a triumph over them means parading Roman dead and Roman defeat as spoils. Some senators refuse to attend. Others attend and say nothing, watching the wagons roll past loaded with captured Spanish silver, and the images of battles fought against men who had once dined in Roman houses and worn Roman togas. Caesar rides through it in a purple robe worked with gold, a laurel wreath on his head that he wears as much to cover his thinning hair as to mark his victory, or so his contemporaries like to joke, and behind him comes the army that has followed him across 3 continents and never once been defeated in a war he personally commanded. He is 55 years old. He has been fighting, campaigning, or governing almost without pause since he crossed a small river in northern Italy, called the Rubicon 5 years earlier, an act that itself began this civil war by making him, technically, an enemy of the Roman state the moment he brought an army onto Italian soil without the Senate's permission. That war is over now. Pompey himself was murdered on an Egyptian beach 3 years before this triumph, stabbed in the back as he stepped off a boat, on the orders of advisers to a teenage pharaoh who thought the gesture would please Caesar. It did not please him. Ancient sources say he wept, or performed weeping, at the sight of Pompey's severed head presented to him as a gift. Whatever he felt privately, Caesar spent the years since consolidating what the war had won him. The office of Dictator, meant since the earliest days of the Republic to be a temporary emergency post held for 6 months at most, renewed again and again until the temporary has become, in practice, permanent. He does not call himself a king. Rome has hated that word since it expelled its last one nearly 5 centuries earlier, and Caesar knows it, uses the old aristocratic Roman horror of kingship as fluently as anyone in the city. But the honours keep arriving anyway, faster than the Senate can be said to be freely choosing to grant them, because everyone understands that refusing Caesar anything, at this point, is no longer a realistic option for a legislative body he effectively controls. After the triumph there are games, feasts for the entire population of the city, gifts of grain and money distributed to citizens and soldiers both, a public spectacle of generosity meant to paper over the discomfort of what has just been paraded through the streets. Caesar has, by any measure, won. He controls the army, the treasury, the calendar of public life, the Senate's agenda. What he does not yet know, watching the crowds cheer from his gilded chair set up at the head of the procession route, A chair built and voted to him alone that no other man in Rome is permitted to use is that winning this completely is its own kind of danger. A war fought and lost leaves the losing side broken and grieving. A war fought and won this decisively against fellow citizens leaves a different kind of debt behind it, owed by men who now depend entirely on his continued goodwill for their safety, their careers, their lives, and who have started quietly in private rooms across the city to resent needing that goodwill at all. The triumph ends. The army disperses into veteran colonies that Caesar has promised them across Italy and the provinces, and in the Senate House, freshly returned to daily business, the honours keep coming, month after month, each one a little larger than the one before, until no one can quite say where gratitude ends and fear begins. The gilded chair from the triumph does not go back into storage. It is carried into the Senate House itself and set on its own dais, a permanent fixture now, and Caesar is voted the right to sit in it whenever the Senate meets, dressed in triumphal purple and gold even on an ordinary business day, a privilege no other Roman magistrate in the history of the Republic has held. It is one line among dozens being voted through in the winter after the Spanish triumph, and taken alone it might seem a minor vanity. Taken together with everything else arriving in the same months, it reads differently. Caesar's face appears on Roman coins that winter, struck while he is still alive, the first time any living Roman has been given that honour. Every coin before this carried the faces of gods or of dead ancestors, never a man who could still walk into the room and see his own profile in someone's palm. The month of Quintilis, the 5th month of the old Roman calendar, is renamed in his honour, and the name sticks for the rest of recorded history, July. The Senate votes him the title Parens Patriae, Father of the Fatherland, an honorific meant to sound paternal and reassuring, and that instead makes several senators privately uneasy, because fathers in Roman law hold near absolute power over their households, and calling one man the father of the entire state is not a phrase anyone chooses lightly. A priest, a flamen, of the kind traditionally assigned to worship a god, is designated for a future cult of Caesar's own person, and his name is added to the list recited at public religious festivals, alongside the names of Rome's actual deities. None of this happens as a single dramatic announcement. It happens the way a slow flood happens, one small overflowing stream at a time, decree by decree, session by session, so that by the time anyone tries to point to the moment Caesar became something more than a Roman magistrate, there is no single moment to point to, only an accumulation. Then, in mid-February, the accumulation reaches its clearest point yet. The Senate votes to name Caesar Dictator Perpetuo, Dictator for life. The office of dictator had existed in Roman law for nearly 5 centuries by this point, always as a deliberate emergency measure, a temporary concentration of power granted to one man in a genuine crisis and surrendered again, by law and by custom within 6 months. Even the earlier dictatorship Caesar had held for 10 years running had at least nominally been a series of renewed, technically temporary terms. Dictator for life removes the pretense entirely. There is no renewal date because there is no end date. The word itself, dictator, does not yet carry the purely negative meaning it will pick up many centuries later from very different regimes. In Caesar's Rome it is simply the name of an office, but its content has just changed beyond anything the Roman constitution was ever built to hold, and everyone in the chamber that day understands exactly what has happened even if the vote itself passes with barely a murmur of open dissent, because open dissent by this point carries obvious personal risk. Cicero, the great orator and one of the Republic's most committed defenders, is not in the chamber for many of these votes. He has retreated increasingly from public life, writing philosophical treatises in his country villas instead, and in his letters to friends from this period, a bitterness creeps in that he rarely allows into his public speeches. He compares the Senate under Caesar to a body going through the motions of debate, while everyone already knows the outcome in advance. It is, functionally, correct. The Senate that once decided the fate of the Mediterranean world through open argument between rival factions has become, under Caesar's dictatorship, an assembly that ratifies decisions largely made elsewhere, in Caesar's own household and among his closest advisors, then dresses those decisions in the old republican language of votes and decrees to keep up appearances. Some of the men voting these honours through genuinely admire Caesar, are grateful for the stability his victory brought after years of civil war, or hope for advancement under his patronage. Others vote for the honours because refusing looks, and increasingly is, dangerous. And a smaller number, watching the gilded chair, the coins bearing a living face, the priest assigned to a cult that does not yet officially exist, begin doing something else in private, counting the honours and starting to wonder how many more steps remain between dictator for life and a title Rome has spent 500 years swearing it would never grant to anyone again. Across the Tiber River from the crowded centre of Rome, in gardens Caesar owns privately rather than through any public office, lives a queen the Roman Senate has never voted any honour to at all, and whose presence in the city is, by the strict letter of Roman custom, faintly scandalous. Cleopatra, the pharaoh of Egypt, arrived in Rome roughly 2 years before this final year begins, brought there in the aftermath of the war. Caesar fought on her behalf in Alexandria, a war that had put her back on the Egyptian throne after a civil conflict with her younger brother. She has stayed in Caesar's gardens ever since, on and off, through his campaigns and his triumphs, and Roman gossip, always hungry for material about a dictator too powerful to criticize directly, has focused a great deal of its energy on her instead. She keeps her own court in those gardens, Egyptian in style, and Roman visitors who go to see her, and many do, out of curiosity or genuine diplomatic necessity, come back describing a level of luxury that unsettles a city whose founding political identity still rests, at least in theory, on the old republican virtues of modesty and shared civic sacrifice. There is a son too, a boy named Caesarion, born not long after Cleopatra's arrival in Alexandria years earlier, whom Cleopatra insists is Caesar's own child. Caesar himself never formally acknowledges the boy under Roman law, careful even here, in what is by every account a genuine attachment, not to hand his enemies a weapon they could use against him, since a Roman citizen's paternity claims over a foreign king's heir would carry explosive political implications about his ambitions. But he does not hide the relationship either. He has, remarkably, placed a golden statue of Cleopatra inside the temple of Venus Genetrix, a temple he built in his own forum and dedicated to Venus as the mythical ancestor of his family line, the Julii. A living foreign queen's image standing inside a Roman religious temple, beside the statues of gods, is close to unprecedented, and it does not go unnoticed by the same senators, quietly counting Caesar's other honours that winter. Some Romans whisper that Caesar means to marry her, despite already being married to a Roman wife, Calpurnia, and despite Roman law flatly refusing to recognise marriage between a Roman citizen and a foreign monarch. Others whisper something worse, that he means to move the capital of the Roman world east, to Alexandria or to Troy, the mythical ancestral home the Julian family claims descent from through the legendary hero Aeneas. There is no solid evidence for either rumour, and later Roman historians writing under Caesar's own great-nephew have every incentive to exaggerate the scandal in order to make the eventual conspiracy against Caesar look more sympathetic in hindsight. But the rumours do real work regardless of their truth, because rumours about a foreign queen and an eastern capital land on a political culture already primed to fear that Caesar is drifting from Roman towards something else, something closer to the divine right monarchies of the Hellenistic East that Rome has spent 2 centuries conquering, absorbing, and quietly regarding as decadent. Cleopatra herself is a formidable political operator in her own right, fluent by most accounts in several languages including Egyptian itself, a rarity among the Ptolemaic dynasty that had ruled Egypt in Greek for nearly 3 centuries, without most of its kings bothering to learn the language of the people they governed. Her interest in staying close to Caesar is not romantic sentiment alone. Egypt's independence and her own throne depend on Rome's continued goodwill, and no one in the Mediterranean world in 44 BC commands more of that goodwill or more raw power than Caesar does. She will remain in Rome through the winter, watching the honours accumulate around the man she has staked her kingdom's future on, and she will still be there, in those same gardens across the river, on the day everything changes. The festival of Lupercalia is one of the oldest on the Roman calendar. Older than most Romans in 44 BC can explain the origin of with any confidence, a rite of purification and fertility involving young men running half-naked through the streets, striking bystanders with strips of goat hide in a ritual meant to promote fertility for the coming year. It is exactly the kind of ancient, slightly chaotic public festival that draws enormous crowds, and on the 15th of February, weeks after the Dictator for life vote, Caesar attends in his gilded chair, set up on a public platform in the Forum, dressed once again in the purple and gold he now wears as a matter of course. Mark Antony, his loyal lieutenant and co-consul that year, a man who owes his entire political career to Caesar's patronage, is one of the runners in the ritual, stripped down like the others. At some point in the ceremony, Antony approaches the platform where Caesar sits and offers him a diadem, a white cloth headband that was the standard symbol of kingship across the Hellenistic monarchies of the Eastern Mediterranean, the exact object a Roman audience would immediately recognize as marking its wearer a king. The crowd's reaction is instant and, by every surviving account, largely hostile. Scattered applause from a small section, but a much louder groan and murmur of discomfort from the larger mass of onlookers. Caesar pushes the diadem away. Antony offers it a second time. Caesar refuses it again, and this time, according to the ancient sources, orders that the diadem be taken to the temple of Jupiter and dedicated there, framing his refusal as an act of pious deference to the god, rather than personal modesty. A small but telling piece of political theatre layered onto political theatre. The crowd cheers loudly at the second refusal, more loudly than they had groaned at the offer, and Caesar, watching the reaction, is said to have understood the message clearly. Rome will tolerate almost anything he does, will vote him a lifetime dictatorship and a golden chair and a statue among the gods, but will not tolerate the word king spoken and accepted in public, not yet, perhaps not, ever. What almost no one watching that day can be entirely certain of, and what still divides historians today, is whether the entire scene was staged. Several ancient writers suspected it was a controlled test, arranged in advance between Caesar and Antony, to gauge exactly how the crowd would respond to the idea of formal kingship, before either man committed to pursuing it further. If that is true, the test produced a clear answer, and not the one either man might have hoped for. Others argue Antony acted more independently, testing the water on his own initiative to see how far he might curry favour by pushing Caesar toward a crown, or even, in a less charitable reading, favoured by some ancient sources hostile to Antony, to make Caesar look bad by association with an offer everyone knew would be refused. Whatever the truth of its origin, the effect on Caesar's enemies is unmistakable. For men who have spent the past year watching an accumulation of honours that already looks, in substance, indistinguishable from monarchy, the sight of an actual diadem, physically offered and physically refused in the Forum, in front of the entire city, is not reassuring. It confirms that the idea is now openly on the table, being tested in daylight, and that Caesar's refusal this once carries no guarantee about the next occasion, or the one after that. In the weeks following Lupercalia, several statues of Caesar around the city are found decorated overnight with diadems by unknown hands. And when two tribunes of the plebs, officials whose entire office exists to protect the common people's interests, order the diadems removed and the men responsible for placing them arrested, Caesar has the tribunes themselves stripped of their office, a reaction many Romans read as revealing far more about his actual appetite for kingship than the Lupercalia refusal had concealed. It is a small procedural overreaction against two minor officials over a matter of ornamental cloth, but among a group of men already meeting quietly in private houses across the city, it lands as confirmation of everything they have started to fear. Two of the men who will eventually lead the plot against Caesar owe him their lives twice over, a fact that will matter enormously to how the story is told afterward. Marcus Junius Brutus fought on Pompey's side in the Civil War, at the decisive Battle of Pharsalus in Greece 6 years before this final year begins, a battle Caesar won decisively despite being badly outnumbered. After the defeat, when Pompey's surviving officers scattered or fled, Caesar not only spared Brutus but actively sought him out, reportedly relieved to learn he had survived the fighting, and restored him to full political standing afterward, eventually making him governor of a province in northern Italy, and, in this final year, urban praetor, one of the most prestigious judicial offices in Rome, with a strong implicit promise of the consulship, the Republic's highest office, to follow. Some ancient sources claim, without full certainty, that Caesar felt a particular personal affection for Brutus, tied to a decades-old relationship with Brutus' mother, Servilia, one of the most politically connected women in Rome, though the evidence for exactly what that meant is thin and contested. What is not contested is the pattern of Caesar's behaviour toward his former enemy. Consistent, deliberate favour, extended repeatedly, in a way that goes well beyond simple political calculation. Gaius Cassius Longinus followed a similar arc. He too commanded forces against Caesar in the Civil War, serving under Pompey in a naval role, and he too was pardoned after Pompey's defeat, and eventually given office under Caesar's dictatorship, serving this final year as a praetor alongside Brutus, though in the less prestigious of the two praetorships, a slight Cassius reportedly resented. since he considered his own military record superior to Brutus. This whole policy of forgiving former enemies has a name in Roman political thought. Clementia, mercy, and Caesar has made it something close to a signature virtue of his entire dictatorship, publicized deliberately in his own writings and speeches, as proof that his rule differs from the bloody proscriptions of an earlier dictator, Sulla, who decades before had settled his own civil war by publishing death lists of thousands of enemies and confiscating their property. Caesar wants to be remembered as the dictator who did not do that, who instead absorbed his former enemies back into the machinery of the state, gave them offices, let them keep their property and their dignity. It is by most measures a genuinely humane policy compared to the alternative Roman precedent, and it is also, as it turns out, a serious miscalculation because clemency of this kind leaves the men who received it alive, resentful of needing it in the first place, embedded inside the institutions of power, and under no illusions about how completely their careers and their safety now depend on one man's continued personal favour, rather than on any law or office they hold in their own right. A pardon that can be granted can, in principle, be revoked, and every one of these men knows it, whatever reassurances Caesar offers. Cassius in particular has never been fully convinced by Caesar's public performance of restraint, and in private conversations that circulate afterward. He is remembered as speaking with real bitterness about serving a master rather than a state, about praetorships handed down like gifts from a king to his courtiers, rather than earned through the old competitive machinery of Roman elections that Cassius himself grew up believing in. Brutus, by most accounts, is more genuinely conflicted, torn between personal gratitude towards Caesar and a family legacy he cannot ignore. His distant ancestor, also named Lucius Junius Brutus, was traditionally credited with expelling Rome's last king nearly 5 centuries earlier and founding the Republic itself. Anonymous graffiti begins appearing on statues and public walls around Rome that spring, addressed directly to Brutus, some in the voice of his ancestor, urging him to act as his forebear once had. Whether organised by Cassius, by other conspirators, or genuinely spontaneous expressions of public unease, the graffiti works on Brutus exactly as intended. A man who has been forgiven, promoted, and trusted by Caesar begins to hear, in his own family name written on the city's walls, an argument that forgiveness is not the same thing as safety, and that gratitude to one man might be a smaller debt than the one he owes to 500 years of Roman history. Cassius makes the first approach. According to the ancient accounts closest to the events, it is Cassius, not Brutus, who begins actively recruiting for a conspiracy in the weeks following the Lupercalia incident, moving through his own personal network of friends, relatives, and political allies with a caution appropriate to a plot that carries a death sentence for treason if even one recruit talks. He starts with men he already trusts absolutely, men bound to him by family ties or old political debts, and only gradually widens the circle outward, testing each new candidate's temperament in indirect conversation before ever naming the actual plan aloud. Brutus, once persuaded to join, becomes in some ways more valuable to the conspiracy than Cassius himself, not because of any particular military or political skill, but because of exactly the family name that the anonymous graffiti had already been invoking. Brutus carries a moral authority in Roman political culture that Cassius, for all his sharper political instincts, simply does not possess. His presence in the plot transforms it, in the minds of many who join afterward, from a personal vendetta into something closer to a restoration of ancient republican principle. Men are recruited, in the end, according to Roman historical tradition, in numbers that reach past 60, an extraordinary size for a conspiracy meant to remain secret, drawn from a wide range of backgrounds. Some are former supporters of Pompey like Cassius and Brutus themselves, still nursing old Civil War grievances. Others, more surprisingly, are men who owe their entire careers to Caesar's own patronage, and have benefited enormously from his rule. Decimus Junius Brutus, a different Brutus from Marcus, unrelated by close blood but easily confused by later readers, is perhaps the most striking example. A trusted Caesarian general who had served under Caesar for years in Gaul and in the Civil War, named in Caesar's own will as a secondary heir, and someone Caesar considers close enough to invite regularly to private dinners. His recruitment into the plot against the very man who elevated him will prove, in the end, decisive in ways none of the other conspirators quite manage. Gaius Trebonius, another former Caesarian loyalist and consul, joins as well, reportedly after having already tested Antony's own loyalty months earlier with a cautious, indirect approach about possibly opposing Caesar, an approach Antony did not report to Caesar despite declining to join himself, a detail that later leaves Antony's own position deeply ambiguous. The conspirators meet in scattered private houses, never all together in one place, never using the same location twice in a row, communicating through trusted intermediaries, rather than direct written messages that could be intercepted or later discovered. They debate, in these meetings, questions that will matter enormously for what happens after the killing. Should they kill Antony as well, since he holds the consulship and commands real loyalty among Caesar's veteran soldiers and could rally forces against them afterward? Cassius argues strongly that they should. Brutus, in what later historians widely regard as the conspiracy's single most consequential misjudgment, argues against it, insisting the killing must be confined strictly to Caesar himself, framed publicly as the elimination of a tyrant rather than a broader purge of his allies, a distinction Brutus believes essential to winning public support afterward for restoring the old republic. The argument is a genuinely principled one from Brutus' perspective, rooted in his belief that Romans will rally to a clearly moral act of tyrannicide, but recoil from what would look like simple factional murder. It will also, within weeks, prove catastrophically wrong about how Antony chooses to use the survival he is granted. What the conspirators need now is only two things: a date and a place where Caesar can be reached without the protection of the armed bodyguard he has, in fact recently dismissed, believing after so many honours and so much apparent public goodwill that he no longer requires one. The date that forces the conspirators' hand is not one they choose themselves. It is chosen by Caesar, and it belongs to a war he has not yet fought. For more than a decade the Parthian Empire, a vast realm stretching from the eastern edge of Roman Syria through Mesopotamia and into what is today Iran, has stood as the one significant power on Rome's borders that Roman arms have not managed to subdue, and worse, has actively humiliated Rome in the field. 16 years earlier, a Roman army led by the wealthy politician Marcus Licinius Crassus, once a member of the same informal power-sharing arrangement with Caesar and Pompey known to modern historians as the First Triumvirate, was annihilated by Parthian cavalry and horse archers at the Battle of Carrhae in what is now southeastern Turkey, an unmitigated disaster that killed Crassus himself and left Roman military prestige in the east badly damaged. Avenging Carrhae, and finally bringing the Parthian frontier under stable Roman control, has become one of Caesar's clearest remaining ambitions, arguably the last great unfinished project available to a man who has already conquered Gaul, defeated every major domestic rival, and reformed the calendar itself. He begins assembling an enormous army for the campaign that winter, reportedly planning to commit 16 legions and a large force of cavalry, a scale of mobilization larger than almost any single campaign in recent Roman memory, and he sets a firm departure date, the 18th of March, only 3 days after a scheduled meeting of the Senate. The Parthian campaign matters enormously to how the conspiracy's timeline unfolds, for a simple, brutal reason. Once Caesar leaves Rome at the head of that army, he will be gone for years, likely surrounded at all times by loyal legions, who have followed him without hesitation through every previous campaign of his career, effectively unreachable to any domestic conspiracy for the foreseeable future. There is also a rumour circulating that spring, impossible now to verify but taken seriously enough at the time to matter, that a prophecy or an oracle, or perhaps simply a piece of political gossip dressed up as prophecy, has suggested Parthia can only be conquered by a king, and that certain of Caesar's allies intend to propose, while the army is already gathered and Caesar's departure imminent, that he be granted the title of king specifically for the duration of operations outside Italy, on the theory that Romans might tolerate the word applied to a general fighting barbarians abroad, even while refusing to tolerate it applied to a ruler at home. If any such proposal is genuinely planned, it never gets tested, but its mere circulation as rumour adds urgency to a conspiracy that already fears exactly this kind of gradual softening of Rome's resistance to the word king. Whatever the truth of the prophecy rumour, the practical calendar leaves the conspirators with an extremely narrow window. The Senate is due to meet on the 15th of March, the Ides, a date on the Roman calendar that simply marked the midpoint of the month, and carried no inherent ominous meaning until this particular meeting made it famous forever after. It is very likely the last time Caesar will appear in the Senate House, without the protection of the legions gathering outside the city for departure, before he leaves Italy for years. If the conspiracy is going to act at all, it has to act at that meeting 3 days before the army marches. The pressure of that closing window concentrates minds that had for weeks debated method and moral justification in relatively unhurried private conversation. Now there is a date on the calendar, an actual session of the Senate scheduled in a specific building, and a shrinking number of days in which to finalize a plan that more than 60 men, none of them professional assassins, most of them senators and magistrates, with no particular experience in violence, will have to carry out together in a crowded public room without being stopped, without losing their nerve, and without a single one of them talking beforehand to the wrong person. Away from the Senate votes and the whispered meetings in private houses, another, quieter version of this final year is unfolding in the form of stone, ledgers and surveyed land, and it deserves attention on its own terms, because it is this ordinary administrative work, more than any single dramatic honour, that shows what kind of ruler Caesar actually intended to be, whatever title eventually attached to the office. Rome in 44 BC is a city still visibly scarred by the recent civil war and by decades of underlying strain that predate it, a chronically overcrowded population crammed into multi-storey tenement blocks prone to fire and collapse, deep and unresolved debt problems among both the poor and the merely comfortable, tens of thousands of discharged veteran soldiers with land promised to them by a general who has, so far, made good on remarkably little of it. Caesar spends a significant share of his final year addressing exactly these problems, methodically through legislation that shows less interest in personal glory than the honours debates might suggest. He passes debt relief measures, adjusting how existing debts are calculated to ease pressure on borrowers without simply cancelling all obligations outright, a careful middle path that satisfies neither the radical debtor faction who wanted total cancellation nor the creditor class who wanted no interference at all, but that keeps the economy from the kind of debt-driven unrest that had repeatedly destabilized Roman politics in the preceding decades. He expands the Senate itself, adding new members drawn not only from the traditional Roman aristocracy, but from provincial elites, including men from Gaul, the region he had spent a decade conquering, a move some conservative senators find almost as unsettling as the dictatorship for life, since it dilutes the exclusivity of an institution that had, for centuries, been the near-exclusive preserve of old Roman and Italian families. He orders the resettlement of tens of thousands of veterans and Rome's urban poor onto new land, some in Italy but much of it overseas, including 2 extraordinary refoundations. Carthage, the great North African city Rome had utterly destroyed a century earlier at the end of the Third Punic War, and Corinth, the equally prominent Greek city Rome had likewise razed roughly the same year, are both ordered rebuilt as new Roman colonies, populated with Roman settlers, a striking symbolic reversal of 2 of the Republic's most brutal historical acts of destruction, undertaken, as far as the surviving evidence suggests, more for practical demographic and economic reasons than any grand gesture of reconciliation, though the symbolism was almost certainly not lost on contemporaries either way. In Rome itself, construction continues on the Forum of Caesar, a new public square and temple complex Caesar has funded personally at enormous cost, adjacent to the older Roman Forum, intended partly as a genuine civic improvement to a chronically overcrowded city centre, and partly unmistakably as a permanent monument to his own name standing at the heart of Roman public life. He is said to have discussed further, more ambitious projects still on the drawing board at the time of his death. A public library modelled on the famous one at Alexandria, a canal to be cut through the Isthmus of Corinth to shorten sea routes between the Aegean and the Adriatic, even a scheme to divert part of the Tiber River to reduce Rome's chronic flooding. None of these grander plans will be realised in his lifetime, and some, like the Corinth Canal, will not be completed by anyone for another 19 centuries. Taken together, this administrative record complicates any simple story about a man interested purely in personal glorification. Caesar spends real time and real political capital this year on debt relief for ordinary citizens, on land for veterans who might otherwise become a dangerous unemployed underclass, on infrastructure meant to outlast him by centuries. It is entirely possible to hold both things true at once, that Caesar genuinely wanted to fix Rome's structural problems, and that he also wanted, and increasingly received, honours that pushed against the deepest taboos of Roman political culture. His enemies, watching the same year unfold, do not experience this as a contradiction requiring reconciliation. They experience competent, popular governance and mounting personal deification as the same problem, arriving from two directions at once, a man who is good at ruling and increasingly unwilling or unable to stop being treated as something more than a mortal Roman magistrate. In the first 2 weeks of March, the conspiracy settles on the details that will decide whether more than 60 men can kill one man in a crowded room without the plan collapsing into chaos before it starts. The location itself is already fixed by circumstance rather than choice. Rome's traditional Senate meeting house, the Curia Hostilia in the Forum, has been under reconstruction for several years, rebuilding after fire damage sustained during earlier civil unrest. So the Senate has been meeting instead in a large hall attached to the Theatre of Pompey, a spacious complex Pompey himself had built decades earlier on the Campus Martius, the open plain west of the city centre, traditionally used for military assemblies and large public gatherings. It is a detail heavy with unplanned irony that will not go unnoticed by contemporaries. The man who will die there is doing so in a building erected by the rival he defeated in the Civil War, beneath the rival's own marble statue, which stands along one wall of the meeting hall as part of the complex's original decoration. The conspirators agree the strike must happen inside this hall during the session itself, while Caesar is seated and surrounded closely enough by his own eventual killers that no bodyguard, even if one were present, could easily intervene in time. They agree on a signal. Lucius Tillius Cimber, one of the conspirators, will approach Caesar with a formal petition asking that Caesar allow his exiled brother to return to Rome, a plausible, ordinary piece of Senate business that will draw Caesar's attention and bring several conspirators close around him under the unremarkable pretext of supporting the petition. When Caesar predictably declines or hesitates, Cimber will pull at Caesar's toga, dragging it down from his shoulder, both a symbolic stripping of his dignity and a highly practical physical signal that will be visible to the rest of the group crowded nearby, telling them the moment has arrived. Servilius Casca, a tribune, is assigned to strike the first blow. They agree not to kill anyone else present, honouring Brutus' earlier insistence on sparing Antony, though Trebonius, at least, is separately tasked with finding a pretext to keep Antony occupied and physically separated from Caesar just outside the hall in the minutes before the session begins, a small but consequential piece of insurance against Brutus' principled gamble. In these final days, warnings arrive from several directions, none of them specific enough in the moment to stop what is coming. A soothsayer, a professional diviner named Spurina, who reads omens from the entrails of sacrificial animals, according to the traditional Roman practice of haruspicy, is said to have warned Caesar some weeks earlier that danger threatened him no later than the Ides of March, a warning vague enough in its original form that later historians have debated how literally to credit the story, but specific enough in hindsight that ancient writers seized on it as an obvious sign Caesar had been given every chance to save himself and chose not to listen. On the night before the 15th, according to several ancient accounts written decades later, doors and windows in Caesar's house are reported to have blown open on their own in a sudden wind, and Caesar himself is said to have woken unsettled from troubled sleep. None of these details can be verified with confidence. Ancient historians writing after the fact had every incentive to embellish the build-up with omens that made the coming assassination feel inevitable and cosmically sanctioned, a common feature of how ancient biography handled the deaths of great men. What is more reliably attested, because it comes from sources closer to the events and involves a person rather than a supernatural sign, is that Caesar's wife, Calpurnia, had a deeply disturbing dream that same night, one she found frightening enough to beg her husband, urgently and repeatedly, not to leave the house the next morning. The dream, as later Roman historians describe it, drawing on accounts that reportedly circulated among Caesar's household in the immediate aftermath, involved Calpurnia holding her husband's body in her arms, murdered, weeping over him in a vision vivid enough that she wakes in genuine terror and cannot be reassured back to sleep. Some versions of the story add a second image alongside it, the pediment of their house, a decorative gable that the Senate had specifically voted permission for Caesar to add to his roofline as a personal honour, collapsing in the dream, or a portion of Caesar's household statuary somehow falling or bleeding. The exact details vary between the ancient sources, written decades after the event by historians working from oral tradition, and earlier written accounts now lost, which is itself a useful reminder that we cannot be fully certain how much of this specific dream account reflects what genuinely happened that night versus what later storytelling added to make the coming tragedy feel foreshadowed. What all the surviving versions agree on is the outcome. Calpurnia wakes deeply shaken, and in the morning she pleads with Caesar not to attend the Senate meeting scheduled for that day, urging him to send word that he is unwell and postpone the session. And for a period that morning, by most accounts, Caesar actually agrees with her. He has, after all, other reasons for hesitation beyond his wife's dream alone. Spurina's earlier warning about the Ides is presumably still somewhere in his mind, and Caesar, whatever his public confidence, was not by temperament a man who dismissed religious omens entirely, having held the senior priestly office of Pontifex Maximus, chief priest of Rome's state religion, for many years and taken its responsibilities seriously throughout his career. He sends word, according to the sources, that he intends to postpone the Senate meeting, perhaps citing illness, and settles in at home that morning, rather than preparing to leave for the theatre of Pompey. It is at this point, with the entire subsequent chain of events genuinely hanging in the balance for what may have been less than an hour, that Decimus Junius Brutus arrives at Caesar's house. Decimus is, from Caesar's perspective, one of his most trusted generals, a man who has served under him loyally for years and been named in his will, and his arrival that morning carries none of the suspicion it perhaps should. He has been sent, in effect, by the other conspirators specifically because his closeness to Caesar makes him the one man capable of overriding Calpurnia's warning without raising alarm. According to the sources, Decimus gently mocks the idea of a Roman dictator cancelling an important Senate session because of his wife's bad dream, warns that postponing will look weak and will insult the assembled senators who are waiting for him, some of whom, he suggests, might interpret a cancellation as evidence Caesar no longer respects the Senate's authority at all, precisely the kind of perception Caesar has spent months trying to manage. He may also have mentioned, according to some accounts, that the Senate intended to formally offer Caesar the title of king that day, for use only in the eastern provinces during the coming Parthian campaign, an enticement calculated, if the detail is accurate, to override whatever caution the omens had inspired with the pull of exactly the kind of honour Caesar has spent the whole year accumulating. Caesar changes his mind. He rises, dresses, and prepares to leave for the meeting after all, walking out past his troubled wife and into a morning that a large number of men across the city have spent weeks quietly preparing for, carrying, hidden beneath their togas, the daggers they intend to use before midday. The walk from Caesar's house to the theatre of Pompey takes him along streets crowded with the ordinary business of a Roman morning, and also, on this particular day, with a small number of people who have information they are desperately trying to get to him before he reaches the meeting hall. One of these is a Greek teacher of rhetoric living in Rome, a man named Artemidorus, who has apparently learned some or all of the conspiracy's details, possibly through a student or acquaintance connected to one of the plotters, though the sources leave the exact chain of information unclear. Artemidorus writes it all down on a small scroll, a document that, had it been read in time, would reportedly have named the conspirators directly, and pushes through the crowd of petitioners that habitually surround Caesar during any public appearance, a crowd of ordinary citizens hoping to hand him requests, appeals, and formal petitions of the kind that pile up faster than any single administrator, however diligent, could realistically process. This is, by 44 BC, simply what walking through Rome looks like for Caesar, a moving current of paper held up by hands hoping to catch his attention for one moment, on every subject from land disputes to citizenship requests to pleas for a relative's pardon. Artemidorus manages to press close enough to hand his scroll directly to Caesar, and by some accounts even urges him specifically to read it immediately, insisting the matter concerns him personally and cannot wait. Caesar takes it, he does not read it, whether because of the sheer press of the crowd, the ordinary rhythm of a man used to receiving dozens of such scrolls on any given walk through the city, and reflexively deferring most of them for later, or simply because nothing about Artemidorus' urgency stood out from the general urgency every petitioner in that crowd always projects. Caesar folds the scroll or hands it to an attendant to add to the others, and continues walking. It is, in hindsight, the single narrowest surviving margin in the entire story, the clearest point at which the specific knowledge that could have stopped everything existed, physically, in Caesar's own hand, and simply went unread. He also passes, on this same walk, according to at least one ancient account, the soothsayer Spurina again, and is said to have remarked to him, half in mockery, that the Ides of March had come, as if the earlier warning had proven empty, to which Spurinna reportedly replied only that the day had come, but had not yet gone. Whether this exchange happened exactly as later writers recorded it, or was reconstructed afterward to sharpen the story's sense of doom, it captures something true about the psychology of that morning. Enough warnings had now accumulated, from enough different directions, dreams and omens and a soothsayer's caution, and finally an actual written document naming names, that a modern reader can feel the weight of mischances pressing down on every step of that walk. And yet each individual warning, taken alone, was exactly the kind of thing a powerful man surrounded by petitioners and superstitions, and flattery hears constantly and has long since learned to discount. Caesar reaches the theatre of Pompey a short while later. He is carried in a litter part of the way, according to some accounts, and walks the final stretch, greeted along the way by senators already arriving for the session, some of them, unknown to him, carrying blades hidden in the folds of their togas. He takes his seat in the meeting hall, in the gilded chair reserved for him alone, beneath the marble gaze of Pompey's statue standing along the wall, and the Senate's business for the day begins. Lucius Tillius Cimber approaches first as planned, presenting his petition on behalf of his exiled brother, and other conspirators gather closer around Caesar's chair under the unremarkable cover of appearing to add their own support to the request. A crowd of senators pressing near enough that nothing about the scene looks unusual to anyone watching from a short distance across the hall. Caesar hears the petition and, as expected, declines it, likely with some visible impatience at what by now feels to him like a routine piece of business rather than anything unusual. Cimber then grasps Caesar's toga at the shoulder and pulls it down the agreed signal, an act that a startled Caesar reportedly reacts to first as a shocking breach of physical propriety rather than an act of violence, exclaiming something to the effect of demanding to know what this violence means, before Publius Servilius Casca, standing close behind him, strikes the first blow, a glancing cut near the neck or shoulder rather than a clean, fatal strike. What follows, according to the historian Suetonius, writing more than a century later with access to earlier accounts now lost, is chaotic and fast. Caesar, wounded and evidently still capable of resistance in the first instance, turns on Casca, reportedly grabbing his arm and stabbing at him with a stylus, the pointed metal writing implement he would have been carrying before the sheer number of men now closing in around him, more than a dozen at minimum according to the sources, makes further resistance impossible. Blades come from every side. Men who had never planned to strike more than once, driven by fear of standing out as the one conspirator who held back, and by the simple momentum of a mob action once it begins, stab at Caesar again and again, several of them, by later accounts, wounding each other by accident in the crush of bodies around a single collapsing man. Suetonius records 23 wounds in total on Caesar's body, though a physician who later examined it, according to the same account, judged only one of them, a wound to the chest, to have been fatal on its own, a detail that says as much about the panicked inexperience of the attackers as it does about the ferocity of the attack itself. Popular tradition, cemented centuries later by William Shakespeare's play rather than by any Roman source, holds that Caesar's final words, on recognizing Brutus among his attackers, were the Latin phrase et tu, Brut, meaning even you, Brutus. There is no reliable ancient evidence Caesar said this. Suetonius reports only that some witnesses claimed Caesar said nothing at all in his final moments, while others reported he addressed Brutus in Greek, the language of Roman upper-class education and private conversation, with a phrase that translates roughly as "you too, child," a remark historians still debate the exact meaning and tone of, whether it expressed betrayal, resignation, or even, in one minority reading, an ambiguous suggestion about a closer personal relationship between the two men than the historical record can otherwise confirm. What is far better attested is where Caesar ends up. Wounded repeatedly and no longer resisting, he pulls the folds of his toga up over his head and face, a gesture Hant writers interpret as a final act of dignity, refusing to let the crowd see his expression as he dies, and falls at the base of the great marble statue of Pompey, standing along the wall of the hall, the same rival whose son Caesar had defeated at Munda less than a year before, whose triumph over Roman blood had opened this entire final year. Ancient sources describe blood pooling at the statue's base, an image so vivid and so heavy with irony that later writers, including several who never witnessed it, treated it almost as a piece of deliberate staging by history itself. the man who had ended the old republic's last great rivalry dying, quite literally, in the shadow of the man he had defeated to do it. For several minutes after Caesar falls, nothing organised happens at all. The senators not involved in the killing, the vast majority of the men present that day, scatter in genuine panic, some fleeing the building entirely, uncertain whether the violence is confined to Caesar alone or marks the opening of some wider massacre. The conspirators themselves, having planned the killing itself down to the smallest signal, appear to have given comparatively little thought to what should happen in the minutes immediately afterward. Brutus, according to the sources, tries to address the fleeing senators, holding up a bloodied dagger and calling out that liberty has been restored, but there is no crowd left in the chamber organised enough to respond to the appeal, and the group of conspirators, still armed, ends up marching instead out of the building and across the city to the Capitoline Hill, one of Rome's most sacred and defensible high points, where they hole up for the rest of the day, uncertain of the public reaction and uncertain, crucially, of whether Caesar's veteran soldiers stationed around the city and in nearby camps will move against them. That reaction, when it comes over the following hours and days, is neither the immediate gratitude Brutus had hoped for nor open civil war, but something more unsettling, confused, anxious silence, as ordinary Romans wait to see who will actually control the city now that the one man who had controlled it for years is dead. Mark Antony, the consul who survived Trebonius' distraction and Brutus' principled refusal to have him killed alongside Caesar, spends those first uncertain hours in hiding, reportedly disguised as a slave, before emerging once it becomes clear the conspirators have no immediate plan to seize further power by force. Within days, a fragile political settlement is negotiated in the Senate. The conspirators will not be prosecuted for the killing, in exchange for confirming that Caesar's existing laws, appointments, and decrees remain valid. It is a compromise that satisfies almost no one completely, and it does not survive Caesar's funeral. Caesar's will read publicly around this time, names his young great-nephew Gaius Octavius as his primary heir, and remarkably, formally adopts him as a son, a detail that will matter enormously in the following years, but that produces less immediate reaction than another provision. Caesar has left a substantial cash sum to every Roman citizen individually, along with his private gardens across the Tiber, the same gardens where Cleopatra had been staying, willed to the public as parkland. The funeral itself is held in the Forum, the body brought out on an ivory couch, and Antony, as the surviving consul, delivers the funeral oration, a customary practice for a man of Caesar's rank. What Antony actually said cannot be fully reconstructed word for word, since the versions preserved by later historians and dramatised by Shakespeare centuries after are almost certainly embellished, but the consistent core across the ancient sources is that Antony, without ever directly attacking the conspirators by name, methodically recounted Caesar's wounds, his generosity toward the very citizens now watching, and the terms of his will, building the crowd's emotion carefully rather than through open incitement, until the mood shifted from grief into fury entirely on its own. At some point during or immediately after the oration, the crowd, no longer waiting for any organised funeral procession to a burial site, begins tearing apart nearby benches, shop counters, anything wooden within reach, and builds an improvised pyre right there in the Forum, burning Caesar's body on the spot in a spontaneous, unplanned cremation. The same crowd, inflamed further in the hours that follow, turns violent, attacking the houses of several conspirators, and in one grim, well-documented case of mistaken identity, kills a Roman poet named Cinna, tearing him apart in the street after confusing him with one of the conspirators who happened to share his name, a detail ancient sources record specifically because of how starkly it illustrates how far the city's mood had travelled, within a single day, from the conspirators' hoped-for celebration of restored liberty. By the end of the week following the funeral, most of the conspirators have fled Rome, unable to remain safely in a city whose public mood has turned decisively against them despite the earlier amnesty the Senate had negotiated. Brutus and Cassius leave for the eastern provinces, where they will spend the following 2 years raising armies and taxing Roman territories in a desperate, ultimately doomed attempt to build a military force capable of defending the republic they killed to save. A republic that, in the meantime, is already reorganizing itself around exactly the kind of one-man concentration of power the assassination was meant to prevent. Antony, in the immediate aftermath, is the obvious figure positioned to inherit Caesar's political machine, controlling as consul much of the apparatus of state and enjoying real loyalty among Caesar's veteran soldiers. But Caesar's will has introduced a second claimant nobody fully anticipated. Gaius Octavius, the 18-year-old great-nephew named as Caesar's adopted son and principal heir, a young man with no military record, no significant political experience, and, as it turns out, a formidable and patient political instinct that almost no one in Rome, including Antony, correctly judges in these first weeks. Taking his adoptive father's name, he becomes known to history as Octavian, and over the following months he begins assembling support with a combination of financial promises to Caesar's veterans, a deliberate and repeated public invocation of his adoptive father's memory, and a willingness to align temporarily with whichever faction serves his immediate interests, including, remarkably, an uneasy alliance with some of Caesar's own former enemies against Antony, before eventually reversing course entirely and joining Antony and a third general, Lepidus, in a formal power-sharing arrangement historians call the Second Triumvirate. That arrangement will, within 2 years, hunt down and eliminate Brutus and Cassius both, at the Battle of Philippi in Greece, closing the immediate chapter the conspiracy opened. It will also, within another dozen years, collapse into a final civil war between Octavian and Antony, ending with Octavian's total victory and, a few years after that, with the Roman Senate granting him a new title, Augustus, and a form of authority that succeeds where Caesar's had failed in appearing to preserve the outward forms and language of the old republic, its senate, its consuls, its ancient offices, while quietly holding all the substantive power those offices used to actually contain. Augustus rules for over 4 decades without ever again forcing Rome to openly confront the word king, having learned, evidently, the one lesson his adoptive father's death had to teach, that the honours themselves were never really the danger, only the visible speed and openness with which they had been claimed. What the conspirators achieved, in the end, was not the restoration of the Roman Republic they believed they were fighting for, but its final, irreversible end, arriving a generation earlier than it might otherwise have, and delivered by exactly the crisis of civil war and uncertainty their own act of violence had guaranteed. The gilded chair, the golden coins bearing a living man's face, the statue of a foreign queen inside a Roman temple, the diadem offered and refused in front of a cheering crowd, none of these honours killed the Republic on their own. It was the killing itself, meant to stop them, that finished the work the honours had only begun. Weeks after the Ides of March, the gilded chair that had been built for Caesar alone still stood in the Senate house, and for a while nobody moved it and nobody sat in it either. The statue of Pompey, at whose feet Caesar had fallen, remained where it had always stood, its marble scrubbed clean of what the ancient sources say, pooled at its base. The scrolls that used to pile up faster than he could read them went, in the end unopened by him but not by history. His will named an 18-year-old great-nephew as his heir, a young man almost nobody in Rome had reason to fear yet, and that quiet paragraph did more to determine the next century than any dagger in the Senate that day. The men who killed Caesar believed they were restoring a republic that had one king too many. Within 2 years most of them were dead, and within 14 the republic they meant to save was gone regardless, replaced by exactly the kind of one-man rule they had killed to prevent, only steadier, because the man who built it had watched his adoptive father die of trying to be too visibly first among equals, and had learned not to make that mistake. The lamp in Caesar's study, the story goes, burned late on the nights before his death, over papers he never finished reading. It went out that spring, and something larger than one man's life went out with it, and something else, not yet named, was already being lit in its place.